Now, this portion we'll talk about two things. We'll talk about engagements, okay, and growing solution engagements into enterprise opportunities, and we will try to apply our solution architecture framework in engagements. Now, these last 2 points, these would be very specific activities for solution architecture that's not really related to the architecture. In fact, they're more relevant to IT consulting. But nevertheless, it's good for you to be aware of certain things about uh, how you can actually sell the idea, sell the solution architecture to potential clients. So, first, we try to see how we can match, okay, or try to, it says here, growing solution engagements into opportunities for some of our clients, okay, especially the bigger ones. So, we start off with this question: do you have an enterprise architecture? And this may seem very trite. You ask a client, do you have an enterprise architecture? And the responses can be varied. They can say, well, I don't have an enterprise architecture. Or they can say, I do have an enterprise architecture. Or they can say, what the hell is enterprise architecture? Okay. But you do know that with an architecture of some sorts, okay, you are well positioned to take advantage of business opportunities that the company or the client would be faced with. So we know that without an enterprise architecture, new solutions may create silos and replicate infrastructure. And this becomes costly, this becomes difficult. Okay. Now, every solution engagement or every dealings with a client at a solution level is actually an opportunity to upsell, okay, to the enterprise level, right? We said earlier that solution architecture is different from enterprise architecture. Nevertheless, both of them follow the same framework, they follow the same processes, they follow the same framework at the root of it. In solution architecture, we're just looking at specific solutions. But when you take a look at EA or enterprise architecture, you're now looking at it at a much larger level. Okay? So enterprise architecture enables concerted alignment with the business. So this is everything, the entire business. It also deals with interoperability. It enables efficient and effective use of IT resources, especially by balancing infrastructure and reusing intellectual capital. Now, especially if you have a large organization and there are some common areas or common functions across that organization, well, reuse and shared infrastructure would be an advantage. And lastly, enterprise architecture enables balanced trade off between enterprise level consistency and project level optimization. Now, how does EA relate to SA? How does enterprise architecture relate to solution architecture? Well, enterprise architecture is generally a reference architecture, right? It's not a specification. It's not a customized architecture. It could be to some degree, but compared to a solution architecture can be extremely customized. Okay? And the idea with enterprise architecture is you don't implement an entire enterprise architecture in a single project. Um, Solution architectures are the means by which enterprise architectures are implemented. So you can view it as in this way that the enterprise architecture is like the superset of the smaller solution architectures that you craft. Okay, and the enterprise architecture is grown and implemented solution by solution. So these are things that are done in one big time effort, right? Definitely as a singular initiative, it can be done continuously. but the amount of effort that's required to build an enterprise architecture would be proportional to the number of solution architectures that you intend to build, right? And nowadays, you don't really have to start from scratch as far as enterprise architectures go. There are many enterprise reference architectures that are available, and you don't need to go far in that respect. Now, the another peculiar thing about enterprise architecture is that it implies governance. Okay. So let's talk about governance. Well, IT governance is about who has decision rights and input to key IT decisions. What is desirable behavior in the enterprise? Okay. And what mechanisms are used to implement governance? Governance, IT governance in this case, is perhaps no different from the typical management governance that we are aware of or we would know. The only difference is that this pertains to IT. Uh, and governance is important to consider because if you remember what architecture is all about in our metaphor, it's a bridge connecting business and IT. So without IT governance, enterprise architecture, you know, would be just some drawing. It would just be a bunch of plans collected in some binder, but that may be impressive when you read it, but after first glance, you're probably going to put it at the top of the shelf, never to see the light of day again. I mean, that's quite possible. But IT governance provides uh, the reality of that of that enterprise architecture. It gives it life in a way. That's normal course of business if you think about it. Governance addresses how the architecture is changed, what the architecture applies to. Okay, so there are scope considerations, there are limitations. Okay, it addresses how conformance to the architecture is enforced. So they're the ones who say, okay, which projects are supposed to go because these projects actually fit the architecture, and which projects have to be ignored because they don't conform to the architecture. That's what governance does. And governance, because you have limited resources, would also be engaged in prioritization. So assuring that a solution architecture conforms to an enterprise reference architecture is part of the problem of IT governance. In relation to architecture, that's really what IT governance does, right? It's like a standards enforcer. As far as IT goes, right? Not only would it be responsible perhaps for the execution or implementation of projects, but even prior to that, they will have to make a decision which projects go in, which projects don't, um, and that's fine. And that makes it more efficient. That makes it more successful. Okay, and nowadays we're seeing these functions given more prominence in a lot of organizations. So they're putting people of higher authority doing IT governance. Back then, IT would have been viewed as simply like an implementer, right? Nothing more than perhaps a glorified supplier, a glorified vendor that happens to be your employee, right? But it's as if IT is just really relegated to support. But no, I mean nowadays the paradigm has changed, the paradigm has improved. That IT does have a seat at the governance table, and this is what they do as far as governance work goes. Now, how do we apply architecture frameworks in a lot of our engagements? So we now go more or less to the idea of consulting, right? And if we look at the solution life cycle, uh, this linear uh, path, if you may, it's a simplified view of how solutions get implemented. Okay, so normally you start with with a defined phase, and then you go plan, develop, incubate, grow, and mature. Okay. Now, where does the solution architecture framework fit into this life cycle? Right. Well, number one, if we take a look at the solution architecture concept, it is required to move from develop to incubate. Right. Naturally, a solution or an idea of solution to be incubated, well, you need to have some solution, right? You need to have like a draft. And your solution architecture concept is like the sketches of sketches, right? It's not yet solid, it's not yet firmed up. A lot of questions still remained unanswered. That's fine. But at least you have a starting point. It's a draft. And you need that draft in order for you to move from develop to incubate. Now, you will need a blueprint to move from incubate to grow. So now, and if you think about grow, it's really about starting, it's really about executing it, implementing things. You can look at it that way. But naturally, between develop, incubate, grow, this is where your framework really starts to be viewed as important, okay, at least from an architecture standpoint. And it might be good that in any IT consulting engagement, right, you have someone, not necessarily an architect. It's good that if you have a solution architect in your team, right, but someone who has solution architecture knowledge or skills, not necessarily an architect, because this would help make your solution a little bit more relevant, a little bit more accurate, if you may. And they're actually there to help improve the chances of you winning the account or winning the client. Okay, making sure that you're able to implement projects for them. So this is another way of how we look at customer engagements. We normally have opportunity creation, opportunity evaluation. So this is really at the start. We call this pre-sales in some cases, because you're not yet selling, right? You're just trying to lay the groundwork in order for you to eventually sell, right? And eventually, once you've started the opportunity creation and evaluation, then you do the development and really bidding for that project. Okay. And only then after you've been awarded for that project that you actually do the delivery. And as we said earlier, delivery refers to project management. So a lot of the project management knowledge and skills will be applicable in this delivery phase. But even prior to that, when you look at the pre-sales and sales portions of the life cycle, where does solution architecture fit into the grand scheme of things? Okay. So if you look at the four views, they actually help identify gaps, identify opportunities. If you remember the six architectural elements of drivers, goals, and metrics, they help in crafting or understanding opportunities. Okay, plural. It did not just be one opportunity. It could be several. And in fact, even if the client disclosed, I want XYZ, naturally, XYZ is an opportunity, but it need not be the only opportunity in that company. You can actually demonstrate your maturity, okay, and expertise by saying, okay, I recognize that you have XYZ, and I also see that you have other opportunities here that would help your business grow so much further, right? So that's part of opportunity creation. And by looking at the four views, it allows you to unpack all these gaps, all these opportunities. Now, and then when you try to evaluate, okay, which opportunity is feasible, which opportunity is viable, okay, then you start to probe further for each view. Okay. And remember, we're talking about solution architecture here. We're not talking about the enterprise architecture yet. Okay. So we're just looking at a specific solution. Okay. And you ask key questions. And then later on, when you start to bid, okay, so These are things that would be used as input for your proposals. Okay, principles, models, and standards. Generally, these are things that would have to be um, imputed into your proposal to your client. Okay, you may want to give examples. You may probably want to give references, especially if you've had previous customers that had the same experience, the same problem as this current client. It would be good to give examples or references. Lastly, when you execute it, okay, so really the actions that you've defined, okay, one of the attributes of the principles, that's the time you actually execute things. So if you do the framework really well, okay, when you go out and do consulting, it's pretty much straightforward. You have a framework that you can use. Okay, of course there are other frameworks as far as consulting goes, but this is one way. I mean, if you're dealing with something that's IT related, for sure this will help you have a better grasp of the engagement. Okay, at least you have some framework that you can use, as opposed to what is called as doing things on the fly. Well, in this case, you're not going to do things on the fly. You have some structure. All you have to do is just go with the structure, and then trust that the structure will provide you all the deliverables that you'll eventually need, and that's it. So how can we look for opportunities? Okay, we've mentioned this in a way in the previous lectures. Okay, so we look at the drivers, we look at the goals, and we said the sources of drivers and goals, even principles, they abound, right? You can get it from published materials, you can get it from interviews, you can get it from anything. I mean, you can get it from any possible source. In other words, the sources of data to help you look for these opportunities, they're accessible. It's just a matter of identifying what to use, okay, sorting out the useful from the useless, and there you have it. Okay. And then for each view, okay, we said we look at 4 views simultaneously. It's important that you understand the implications, obstacles, and consequent actions. Okay, because eventually your clients may ask you, okay, so granted everything that you say is true, granted this is logical, right? What does that mean for me? What will I be faced with if I take on this opportunity? Well, this is where the implications, obstacles, and actions come into the picture. Okay, and if you are very clear, you're very comprehensive with these implications, obstacles, and actions, you actually are able to help your client understand what he or she might be faced. Okay, if he or she is going to take on this opportunity. Okay, now some caveat here, a word of warning, if you may. If the opportunity is real and we don't respond, for sure somebody else will. Remember, it's an opportunity. It's not an opportunity that is make believe, right? I mean, if it's a legit opportunity and you are not going to tackle that, chances are there will be someone who will pounce on that. Okay, and as a business, if you're in this business selling IT solutions, well, you lose out the business. So when is solution architecture needed? Well, these are some examples that we can look into. Okay, so if the project introduces both technical and operational business changes, if it impacts multiple groups, if the scope of the project is not clear and boundaries have been arbitrarily established, okay, the project outcome must satisfy multiple objectives, requirements are undefined, incomplete, and not well understood, major decisions affecting the project will be made by different individuals or organizations, consensus is lacking. All right, just a little bit of note here. We know that important to architecture is having to deal with stakeholders. Okay, so they're very crucial in getting consensus. If there are multiple alternatives or choices in design or implementation, okay, support by users or other stakeholders is critical to the success of the project. Okay, or if the project must be completed in multiple phases over a significant span of time. Typically, if you're talking multi-year implementations, and the consequences of failing in the project would be high. Maybe lost business, okay, maybe regulatory sanctions. I mean, you could think of possible pains, right? If the project is not well implemented. So you probably would want to look at applying solution architecture based on these two dimensions. Okay, is the scope complex, and is it something that's new, at least new to the client? If the complexity is low and if it's not new, meaning there's some reference there, something that you can there's somebody or some other client who's done it before and has done it successfully, then you probably don't need a solution architecture. Okay. Um, Maybe if it's a very very specific item, right? I mean, that's one low complexity situation, right? Okay, you don't need solution architecture. But if it's so complex, meaning it spans across multiple units, multiple geographies, okay, and it's new, meaning nobody in a similar situation as yours would have done this, then coming up with a solution architecture is needed. Now you might be asking, what's going to happen in the other two quadrants? Okay, quadrant 2 and quadrant 4. Well, low complexity, but it's something that's new. Sometimes, okay, or more often than not, you might need solution architecture. High complexity, nothing really new. Okay, well, you probably would need solution architecture. So I guess the main message of this chart is the only time that you would not use solution architecture if the solution to a problem is already known and it is in a low complex environment, something that's quite straightforward. And typically, what you do is you just simply implement something that is off the shelf. Maybe you just buy a product, read the manual, install, implement, that's it. Okay. Now, when is solution architecture? Well, maybe that's not needed. Okay, or I said the project is simple and primarily it's technical in nature, meaning there's no business impact so much, right? Or if the reason why the effort is needed is clear to everyone, so I mean everybody's on board, the project is bounded and the scope well defined, especially if it's not high complex situation. The requirements are well understood and clearly documented. Okay. I mean, if the requirements are already well established, then what else do you need to know, right? I mean, all you have to do is just execute the project. A single individual or group is responsible for making all relevant major decisions. Okay, well, you probably don't need an architecture for that. Stakeholder participation is not required. Maybe the impact of that project is not really that big as well. So there's really no need to involve the stakeholders. The identified risks, including the risk of not doing anything, are known and considered very low. So even if the project fails, okay, no problem. Yeah, it's not we're gonna lose money if that project fails. Okay, maybe you don't need the solution architecture for that. Okay. So here are examples in determining when SA is needed. Okay, so determine which of these cases, okay, whether or not solution architecture is needed. So a new enterprise-wide mail system or upgrading a local area network. Well, if you want an enterprise-wide email system, okay, then probably you need a solution architecture. Okay, here are some of the points why it is so, and you can just refer it to the previous slides. And upgrading a local area network, do you really need a solution architecture for this? Well, the answer is no. I mean, you probably don't need it because if the matter is just to upgrade it, then you just upgrade it. However, this is still an opportunity because now you can probably take a look at network in a more holistic fashion. Maybe upgrading it is uh, underneath the need to upgrade your local area network. Maybe there are some business related issues that require attention. Okay, but it's not clear cut. But obviously, if the task is just to update the system, okay, you don't really need a solution architecture for that. It's quite clear what you need to do. Okay. Now, and when you start doing consulting work and you use solution architecture, here's the bottom line. Well, number one, know your customer. Okay, you have many tools, many sources at your disposal, and emphasize outcomes in terms of values, not outputs. Okay, there's a difference between outcome and output, right? Output would be the more immediate consequences of an activity. That's an output, right? Um, Outcome refers to what happens when the output has been completed. Okay, so outcomes would really be far, far away if you think about it in terms of timeline. So if you look at it from the perspective of a class, teaching in a class, well, output would be referring to the things that we require of the students. Those are the deliverables, right? Papers, quizzes, projects. So those are the outputs. But the outcome of that course is the learning outcomes. What have you learned? Have you gained skill? Okay, what type of skills? Have you gained certain competencies? Have you gained certain knowledge? Those are outcomes. Okay, but the output would be okay, the papers, the exams. Okay, so that's the difference between outcome and outputs, right? When we look at outcomes in relation to solution architecture to the client, okay, the value is not just money. It could be a lot of things. Okay, and you should know how the customer measures value. What is really at the heart of the customer? What is the deepest desire of that customer? It may not necessarily be money, okay, especially for for-profit organizations. You know you have to be profitable. You know that money is important. But is that really part of their mission? So you need to know their mission as well, their vision. Promoting, okay, the capability as a team. Okay, you can do solution architecture on your own, right? But you realize that because of the scope of what's done as far as architecture work goes, you have a higher chance of success if you really work as a team. Okay, it's very rare that you see a senior architect do everything on his or her own, and more often than not, they're senior solution architects because they're able to deal with a team. Okay, and here you can use your framework, our framework, anywhere. Could be in any size, any scope, any industry, any point in the life cycle. Of course, leverage any references you may have. Okay, learn from one another. Don't reinvent the wheel. It may be the problem that you're considering right now may have been considered by somebody in the past. Of course, if the problem has been considered in the past, but it was a failure back then, maybe you learn from the mistakes. You try to learn what went wrong and then avoid those mistakes and then come up with something new. And then, of course, looking for opportunities for follow on business. So don't be too fixated with just one project. Of course, at the start, at the immediate outset, you try to execute, right? You do the project, make sure you're successful there. But don't be too fixated with that, even after the project has been completed. Okay? Look for ways to improve the condition of your client. Okay? And this is where you can have follow-on business or upselling things for business. Maybe expanding your framework as an enterprise architecture. Okay. So if somebody says, your client says, I think we need another server. So how do we respond? Okay, so one way is you can ask for the technicals. What size or price performance are you looking for? Okay, well, it should beat the offer that we have from another supplier. Okay, then let's have the spec and we'll see what we can do. Okay, that's one way for you to say that. Or you can do it in another way. You can challenge the rationale. Okay, I mean, you try to dig deeper, you probe. Okay, maybe the reason why they think they need another server is because of something else. Maybe it's driven by some business concern, okay, or by a driver or by a certain pain. You notice the two sets and how they differ. Well, the first set, the dialogue at the left, reaches a certain conclusion faster, right? You just follow what the client tells you. Okay, that's fine. Okay, looks simple. You're able to spend less time. Okay, a little bit more direct, but it doesn't really help them in terms of really solving their problem. It's possible that they haven't really solved their problem. You only fulfilled their want, but as far as what they need, that's something that it's not clear to you yet. Okay, so you can see, if you see the second set, okay, the dialogue at the right, you can see that it moved away from the technical discussion to something that's more business related. Okay, so and then that's how you should be approaching your consulting engagements with clients as far as IT goes. Okay, so architecture provides, okay, architecture increases customer satisfaction by ensuring that the solution provides everything you need, nothing you don't. So we've kept on hearing that throughout the course. Minimum cost for maximum benefit, correct and complete solutions. So these are your guidelines as far as architecture goes. Because customers define what complete means, they upscope the solution themselves. Ask for more because they see the need for it. We shouldn't be scared of the customer probably expanding the scope. Of course, from a project management point of view, you don't want to engage in what is known as scope creep. That is fine because you're now executing the project. But in this case, you're still crafting the solution. So it's important that you go as wide as you can, really push the envelope because you're still at the starting phase. Okay? You're trying to establish your boundaries. So we shouldn't be scared of really keep on expanding our scope further and further and further and further. Okay, when we're defining the architecture. In fact, it's a requirement that we do that. Now, we really try to stretch it out. And we should reach a point wherein they will be the ones to say, no, that's not included. No, that's not really important. So, but then we do the scope creep at the start. We don't do the scope creep when we're executing the project. Okay, and we don't make the customer adapt to our solution. We adapt the solution to our customers' needs. And this goes back to the earlier ideas of really involving stakeholders because they're the ones who really know what's needed for them. Okay. We have a poor idea on what is needed. Okay. Even if it's an internal project, like you're the in-house architect of a company, but sometimes we don't have a perfect view of what is really needed. Okay. So we need to have those skills of listening, of empathizing even with the stakeholders, because we'll be more apt, will be more capable of providing them the solution that they really need. And with that, we end our presentation. Okay, so that's pretty much the last portion of the framework as far as the theory goes. Um, okay.